So happy to be here. This is my hometown, by the way. I left a little while ago, but it is my hometown.
So thank you so much. It's thrilling to be able to talk to you this evening. And I have to say, in addition to all of the accolades this book has been getting, I can say that personally, for me, as someone who works at the Barnes Foundation, who cares a lot about the art, about the institution, it's just so exciting to get this sort of nuanced but also sweeping story of Barnes's life, of this complex life, this legacy that I think more than probably almost any collector, we still so much live with that legacy now. So it's just really exciting for us to get this book, and also exciting to be able to talk about it at our neighboring institution, the Free Library. And so I think you were going to get us started by reading some of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me read a little bit. Apparently, I was in this place several times before the age of 5, before I left Philadelphia. So, of course, I remember it perfectly. So let me read. I'm going to read a couple of passages that I think will give you a good sense of Barnes. The editors of Ex Libris, a Parisian magazine that published in English, had asked Barnes in 1924 to contribute an article on African art as the basis of the whole modern movement, as they said. And Barnes had agreed, but only so long as he could range far beyond that to cover what African Americans had, as he said, achieved in thought, literature, music, and the living of art expression in everyday life. Barnes explained that he had lived and worked with black people for more than 20 years. And as human beings and as artists in living, I have the highest respect for them. His article described black people's subjection, as he said, to the fundamentally alien influence of their Anglo-Saxon oppressors, an oppression that he said was still ongoing. And he talked about how that led to the soul-stirring experiences which always find their expression in great art. For whites, he said, art and religion had become obsolete and meaningless forms, whereas spirituals, an African-American art form that Barnes had known since childhood, ranked, he said, with the biblical poetry that stood at the root of all Christian letters. Those spirituals, Barnes insisted, were, he said, the single form of great art which America can claim as her own. And he was asserting all this at a moment after World War I, when the search was on for a new and uniquely American culture, worthy of the nation's new place on the world stage. He said that African American spirituals were up there with the great cathedrals of Europe as great art. According to Barnes, the new art of America might end up being more black than white, especially since America's nascent modernism was really just an offshoot of the European version anyway, and that, he claimed, was based on African models in the first place. Discussing and presenting the latest works by black poets, Barnes's article bore witness to what he referred to and capitalized as a Renaissance, probably the first time that that was yoked to the word Harlem anywhere, describing this Renaissance as one of the events of our age which no seeker for beauty can afford to overlook. That's Barnes on African American culture at a moment, let's not forget, when a black person was being lynched at least once a month in America, a moment when the pseudoscience of eugenics was taught in every university, including Harvard and Columbia, a moment when white mobs were burning down black neighborhoods in black cities. And Barnes was going to bat for African American culture and African American people at this level in 1924. So that's one side of Barnes. Let's look at another one. Disagree even mildly with Barnes, or provoke his ire through some quite trivial fault, like having studied at the wrong college, and you might receive a letter filled with insults. One harmless journalist who came calling to see the art got labeled a piano player in a whorehouse. That was a jazz age slur that Barnes used again and again. It was his favorite insult. Come up against Barnes on some more consequential matter, or God forbid, have a difference with him over art, and his letter was likely to be mailed far and wide, laying out your intellectual, moral, psychological, and sexual rot. Much as Barnes might truly care about the topic at hand, it's clear that some of these fights expressed a sheer love of battle. Invective came so naturally to Barnes that a good friend like Leopold Stokowski, the conductor, the Philadelphia conductor, of course, could refer in public to Barnes's brutal and sardonic manner. This was when the Barnes Foundation, when it was in Marion, had just opened to the public. Its first day. Stokowski gives a lecture and specifically refers to the founder that he's trying to compliment as having a brutal and sardonic manner. And he probably felt that he was being very kind, to put it so gently. In France, Barnes earned such enmity that the government allowed him to go about armed with automatics. Friends warned that his ferocity was counterproductive, that it often left him further from his goals. He listened and knew they were right, and then let loose another broadside or 10. His toxic masculinity was an incurable affliction. Like many men, he enjoyed suffering from it. He had nothing but fond memories of smashing up a store that sold fake Argerol. The prospect of being arrested or sued always left Barnes tickled pink. Those are the two sides of Barnes, angel and devil.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you started with those two passages, because I think it's so at the root of the book, and what the book does so beautifully is hold in tension this man who's so often at war with himself as well as at war with the world. There's a quote by Ezra Pound, which I've noticed from your book, which I've noticed a lot of the reviewers have mentioned, and I wrote this down, where Ezra Pound described Barnes as living in, quote, a state of high-tension hysteria, at war with mankind. And so I want to talk about, I think a sort of way to organize tonight's talk would be around all of these different contradictions. Yeah. But I think before getting into that, because in a sense I think it's, from your book I got a sense in ways in which it might be at the root of that, is Barnes's childhood. Yeah. And I will say, I often give this quick thumbnail sketch of Barnes's life, and we quick say Barnes came from a poor working class background, and Barnes himself often told this story as, up by his bootstraps, American story, but we go over that very quickly. And your book actually takes time to look at what did it mean to be poor in Philadelphia in the 1870s and 1890s, and illuminates this moment in Philadelphia history that I certainly didn't know about. I think many people don't know about, of this neighborhood, the Neck. So I'd love to just hear you talk about that, and then also how that kind of sows the seeds for so much of the rest of Barnes's life and the projects that he takes on. Yeah, absolutely. Surprise, surprise, as a biographer, I think the child leads to the man. But in this case, I think it's really important. I really think that a lot of the things that go on to shape his life and his bizarre character come from having grown up for the sort of second half of his childhood in this neighborhood that a surprising number of Philadelphians today have never heard of. Yeah. But if you'd asked anyone in 1900 or 1890, they all would have known the term the Neck. For this slum, really all of what you now think of as South Philadelphia, I mean, all of cheesesteak land, that was one of the worst slums in North America. I mean, people would write articles about sort of the picaresque poverty of this slum because it was so horrible. It was flooded, a lot of it, and people literally lived in the mud and fed their pigs in the mud. And that's where Barnes grew up, and it was an unbelievably violent place to grow up. He had to learn to box just to protect himself from the neighborhood thugs. One of them, one of the Veer brothers, sort of famous Philadelphia monsters, he actually crowned him with a bottle, apparently, while he was a kid in the slum, in the Neck. So this was this incredible poverty that he raised himself out of with his brains. I mean, he was an incredibly smart person and got to Central High School, passing these very rigorous exams that he had to pass, and then got to med school at Penn. But I think it's not just the poverty in the Neck that matters so much. It's that he was slightly less poor before that. That when he was born, and for the first maybe 6 or 8 years of his life, things weren't quite so bad. His father was very badly wounded during the Civil War and lost an arm, and was also wounded in the chest. And I think today we'd say he had PTSD. He ended up being an alcoholic and a ne'er-do-well, and the family's fortunes just plummeted. And you can watch
them going to worse and worse rentals and him having worse and worse jobs. And I think that's what, in the end, so it was a sense of having started life not quite so bad and feeling the descent into the neck that made him so vituperative, so aggressive in all sorts of ways, but also so eager he was incredibly eager to climb, but always in enmity with Philadelphia high society. So that's a very strange thing. He's a social climber who hates the social, in a way, right? He wants to climb into high society that he hates so much, and he sort of does that. He climbs, he becomes one of the great collectors, and of course a very rich person, and does it at the expense of high society a lot of the time. Makes a foundation where the one thing you weren't allowed to do was to have fancy parties, right? This is not what rich people did, right? You had an art museum often to show off how you had in fact risen into the world of fancy people that you could then invite for parties. He did not do that. He remained, in a sense, a necker his whole life.
Yeah, no, and I think that, I mean, the book is structured, I think, very convincingly around this series of tensions, which, as you described, can be both very productive and also disastrous. And often, I mean, it's a cliche, but I think often, that someone's best characteristic is also their worst characteristic, and I think that sort of state of tension is so often that for Barnes.
And for many people of that level of success and aggression, the two things don't, often do go together, I think.
Yeah, and so maybe just to sort of think about sort of some of these things that structure this tension for Barnes. One that you open the book with is this idea that his lifelong challenge was to reconcile the demands that reason made on his judgment and the claims that aesthetics made on his feelings. And you set this up, there's a kind of dialectical tension between, judgment and reason and aesthetics and feelings that is, in a sense, productive for Barnes. And I would be curious, one, where do those impulses come from for Barnes? And two, what does he produce out of them, out of that specific tension?
Yeah. Well, of course, his success depends on reason. He goes to, great rational schools, as it were, Central High, places that care deeply about science. And, this was a great moment of flourishing science and science that was producing real results, right? Really changing the world. Electricity, he would have witnessed the arrival of electricity. And of course, his rise from the neck depended on his mastery of science and rational thought. And he talks about it constantly throughout his life when he thinks back on who he has been. That rational side is really important, as it was for many, many, many people. I mean, pragmatism, though it's one of the least pragmatic philosophies, when you actually read the thing, it believes deeply in rationalism. So that's part of it, but then there's this other problem, which is that as a kid yet, from the neck, he ends up going to camp meetings, Methodist camp meetings in the country, and witnesses ecstatic, especially African-American religiosity and the music that was sung at these events, African-American spirituals. And that has a huge effect on him. It really blows him away, and he talks about that throughout his whole life. Of course, that is not exactly the most reason-based set of emotions. So then, once he starts collecting, it's clear, like everyone who's ever collected art, it starts out because you just love the stuff. And then you find excuses for why you love it so much. And that's clearly what happened with him as well. But of course, he's a great rationalist, so what he has to do is find not only reasons for liking it, but rational ways to like it. And he becomes a great formalist, where he rejects subject matter entirely. He rejects emotion-based readings, and he thinks that a painting like this, Horace Pippin, is really just about the color salmon, blue, white, and some lines, right? He's a complete formalist. You don't look at the subject matter, you look at the patterns on the surface. Because that, he thinks, is something that you can actually get right? He's wrong about that, because his 550-page book, The Art and Painting, goes on at vast length. I mean, just interminable length in these formal analysis of individual pictures. And it's very, very smart, and some of the most boring reading you will ever have done in your life. One of the things, I'm an art critic in my spare time, as it were, when I'm not writing books, and one of the greatest pleasures in my life, and in the life of any art critic, is you go in front of a work of art and you just fill notepad after notepad with observations, what it's doing to you, what it looks like. And the most important thing you learn as an art critic is don't transcribe those into the final article, right? That will not be exciting. Barnes made the mistake of transcribing it into his final published works. But the goal was a rational approach to art. Unfortunately, what that led him to do was to narrow his notion of what anyone could get out of art, that everyone had to look at it in this particular way, which in my opinion is actually an irrational way of thinking about what art can do for people. But it gave him this handle on it. It let his rational mind have purchase on this stuff that he knew deep down was actually, partly at least, about emotions and his responses to it.
Well, and another thing and it's so great to have you here as both a biographer but also an art historian to help us tackle this, which is another thing that he, in a sense, wants to marry to that formalist approach is, of course, his progressive politics, which is also, I mean, as you outlined, a huge part of who he is. And I think certainly for a modern viewer, how do you make sense of that? I mean, these feel in many ways like kind of apples and oranges. Yeah. So a formalist approach being one where you're really just, you're not paying attention to the social history, the social content, the subject matter.
What it's about.
Who painted it, what it's about. It's just about, right, it's just about, to use Barnes's shorthand, light, line, color, and form. So taking that, but for Barnes, he sees that as absolutely deeply connected to this other major goal he has in promoting a progressive set of politics. And he sees those two things as working together, or at least he comes up with a way for them to come together. And so I'd be curious to sort of have you help us walk through how that happens, and especially too in his projects. So starting, at the factory, which we can talk about, and then the ways that project carries into the Art and Education Foundation in ways that we're still really living with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really very smart and rational. The way he ties in democracy to his formalism. Let me just start out by saying I'm very proud of the subtitle of this book, His American Dream, because one of the threads in the book that's very important to me is situating him in the progressive movement. And I think Americans have lost track of how important that movement was, right? From about 1890 to 1915, something like that. There were people really trying to improve the country, really trying to get out of the Gilded Age, and make a difference in founding things like the Free Library of Philadelphia, or in fact, in Barnes's case, the Barnes Foundation. And formalism seemed democratic to him, and this makes perfect sense because you don't need a fancy education to be a formalist, right? You can just look at it and say, I like the red, I like the blue, there's lots of curly lines, right? So a formalist approach, in theory at least, though the weird thing about it is that when you read formalist criticism, formalist theory, it seems so highfalutin, right? It doesn't seem like talk of the people at all, because most people actually like to talk about what's in a picture. But it is true that if you teach a formalist method or just encourage someone to look that way, anyone can do it. You don't have to have read, Shakespeare. You don't have to have, your Greek myths, right? You don't have to know Christian iconology. You just look at the thing. And that, of course, seemed very leveling for him in a useful way, that it was part of his democratic agenda. But one of the weird things about his formalism, and it's a little hard to get at exactly, is that weirdly he thought that a formalist analysis let you get at a kind of the social reality that the artist was living. That somehow he wasn't a formalist like my parents, in fact, who were deep formalists and thought that pictures should be looked at in terms of color, light, etc. They started my life as an art lover and art critic. He thought that the formalism itself was a way into sort of the soul of the artist, into things that were deeply social, that were about the world and how to live in it. So it was a very strange, his books are a little hard to parse sometimes, because there seems to be such a gap between those two ideas. But he was not a formalist who believed that art was just for the sake of the forms on the surface. He thought the forms on the surface were for the sake of something more profound. And I think it doesn't really ever get reconciled rationally, but these were two very important ideas for him that he was trying to make cohere, And then he put his money where his mouth was. He actually, he installed a lot of his art in his factory, his little factory in North Philly, and invited his workers, some of whom were illiterate, to look at the art and think about it and talk about it and write about it even, or at least dictate their feelings to other people about it. So this was very serious. I mean, he even let them work only 6 hours a day. He decided that they could produce enough of his antiseptic, Argerol, that made him a fortune in 6 hours a day. So let's spend the other 2 hours in a seminar. And they were seminars about art, formalist approaches to art, but also about Bertrand Russell and John Dewey and important philosophy. So it was really amazing. His belief in the possibility, well, surprise, surprise, he believed that someone could come from nothing and learn a great deal. He was a great example of that. And he really tried to make that true for other people too.
Yeah, and worth noting that these are factories which were integrated factories in which the majority of the workers were African American men and also white working class women that were taking these classes.
Yeah, and he was paying his black workers more than most people were. And in fact, in Philadelphia, black workers are not normally allowed or given jobs in factories. Those were seen as too good for them. Those were not those are jobs that were supposed to be for white people because they were fairly clean and you earned half decent living. Well, Barnes made it a very good living, in fact, and paid pensions to his workers and helped them buy houses. And when a real estate agent is hesitating about selling to black people, Barnes says, no, we won't put up with that. You will sell to these people. You know, he's really quite something when he's not, being a horrible monster to various people.
Well, and I guess that, while we're on the topic, it just makes me think of something that I think is sort of on everyone's minds right now is this democratic project and what art can do and be and mean for it. I mean, one of the things that Barnes is certainly, for anything you can say about him, that he's most insistent on is that art should be doing work in the world. And so I guess in terms of thinking about this, both, as a biographer of Barnes, but also someone who's an art critic who's deeply engaged and committed to the work that art does. What do you make of the Barnes Foundation as a case study in this? I mean, Barnes always presents himself as he's a chemist. He talks in terms of experiments. He talks about the galleries. He describes them as laboratories where he's doing his experiments, which I really like, actually. And so if we think about this marriage between formalism and progressive politics as an experiment towards an American democratic institution, what do you think, what do you learn from it? How do you think the experiment did?
I think he got it almost exactly right, except for getting a big chunk of it wrong.
Yeah.
That is, the notion of it being a laboratory, of being an experiment, is absolutely right. I think that there's people like me get the nature of art wrong a lot of the time. I mean, I'm constantly citing this Berkeley philosopher called Alvin Noé, who's got some great new books about the very nature of art. And what he claims is that artworks are essentially philosophical objects. That what they don't do any of the things that people talk about. They don't make you happy, they don't make you beautiful. Those are side effects. What they do is get you to talk and ask questions. That's what's fundamentally important, is that they're discursive objects. And the way you can tell a work is a work of art is if that's mostly what it does. And what he would say, or the words I put into his mouth, is that the Mona Lisa most of the time is not a work of art. Mostly it's a souvenir of a visit, it's a token of your sophistication, whatever. When someone is looking at it and asking it, what are you and what do you do? Then and only then is it a work of art. And that's what all works of art do. And that's a fundamentally democratic and rational, for that matter, model. That asking questions and demanding complex, interesting questions, complex questions especially. And that's at the heart of democracy. So in a fundamental way, and that's the kind of work that artworks do in the world. Real work, really getting you to think harder and better and in more interesting ways, in a way that I would say almost nothing else in the world does. Most things have a function of some kind or another that's obvious. The one thing about art is you don't know what the hell to do with it. And I've been writing about art for 30 years, and I still don't know what to do with art. And the only time I write a smart review is when I realize that and try to make the work in front of me do something that I hadn't seen it do before. And Barnes is halfway there. Unfortunately, he narrows it and says art can only do this one thing. But certainly close looking, long looking is central to letting art do its work. And letting everyone do that close looking is vital. So he got that right.
Yeah. Well, and I guess maybe it's just in terms of this sort of everyone getting to do it, I think something that also, another contradiction that you point to in your book is Barnes is the patriarchal feminist,
right.
And the role of women at this institution, which is an extraordinary one.
Now, this is interesting to have that image up even for a second there, because that's part of the...
It's part of it. It's part of the complexity of it. And, you know, I think one of the most notable parts of this story that doesn't get told enough, on the one hand, and we can also talk about, you know, all of the nudes, but is the role of not only women, but working class and middle class women at the center of this project. You know, the MoMA recently came out with its book on the old untold histories of the MoMA, looking at the really important role of women.
Founded by women. It was really
founded by women, right? I mean, it's Adlai Aldrich Rockefeller. It's you know, Lily Bliss that founds. So women
and then they hire Alfred Barr.
Exactly.
Right? They go out and hire the guy.
Right. They're the hiring committee. And so women are at the heart of modernism. They are part of that story. But the women at the Barnes are not the usual suspects. They are not these wealthy women. And that I think is fascinating. And some of the names that I think don't get told, you know, aren't well enough known. So there's a lot of interesting women, but are these sisters, Nell and Mary Mullen.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to, you know, to have you tell a little bit of their story.
I mean, you know, they were from I guess, Western Pennsylvania, Central Pennsylvania, had high school, I don't know if even both of them had high school diplomas, one of them at least did, and they start working for Barnes early in, you know, when he first opens his factory, and he just finds them incredibly talented, and he starts paying them way more than you'd expect, and then they contribute. They actually write one of the first book to come out of the foundation is by one of them, and it's about the Barnes theory of art looking already, and they are his, you know, his vital lieutenants. And then this woman, Violette Damazia, that some of you have probably heard of, there she is. She's teaching. This is after Barnes is dead. She really assumes his mantle as the head of the foundation, and some of his quirks too. But vitally important, and she was also Jewish in an era of unbelievable anti-Semitism, and he hired someone else specifically because she was Jewish, and he knew she was getting a rough ride in other places. So he was amazing that way, and collected women with an interest in the fact that they were women. That's very 21st century. Collected this woman called Hélène Perdria, and as far as I can tell, no one has ever done a show about her, but she's super interesting, and it turns out that the 1920s, there was a female component of avant-gardism that was extremely important, and I'm studying that now, actually, in a new project. And it's been completely neglected, that there was a notion of the female avant-gardist that was really, really important, and I think Barnes figured that out. So both in his taste for art, he collected art by women artists in a way that very few, if any, other male collectors did, or any collectors did, and then employed women in his factory and then in his foundation. Didn't just employ them, they were his second in command. You know, they were central to him. So this isn't what you expect, but he was also a terrible lech, as far as I could tell. And certainly early, his business partner accused him of bringing prostitutes into the factory all the time, so he was not a great feminist. And of course, the Barnes Foundation, for those who have been there, has its fair share of naked female flesh. I have a little theory, and it could be completely wrong, but I think if you were as much of a patriarch as him, if you were hiring prostitutes in large numbers, a painting of female flesh, you could almost just see it as round forms, because you had such ownership of flesh in the normal course of things that, in fact, it was too tame, in a sense, to even see it as erotic. That's probably not true, but it's my hypothesis. But he certainly liked piles and piles of naked flesh. And it's, you know, the Renoirs. I'm trying to love the Renoirs. This is kind of interesting. Maybe you were going to ask me about this. You know, endless naked late Renoirs, pink flesh, little heads, you know, not easy to love for us. But that late Renoir was seen in the early 20th century as the greatest recent art just pre-Picasso. Picasso and Matisse both love that work. So when Barnes is collecting it, it's not weird at the time. It doesn't seem saccharine the way it may to us. It seems absolutely sort of the last, I think it's because it's the most stylized of Impressionist work. So they see those nudes as more like Modigliani. They see them as examples of stylizing of the human body. We just see them as kind of caricatures. But it's pretty weird that those paintings that we find so hard to like are the things that people like Picasso and Matisse liked so much.
And respected so much.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that. I was going to ask the question, why so many Renoirs? And then I thought I would let you off the hook, but it's the question we always get.
This is a problematic painting, right? These are very young girls undressing and offering themselves to the eyes of a painter, right? And I love the fact that at the Barnes, right under it, are these three men instead. And that just, he could pretend not to notice subject matter, but he must have noticed the fact that there are three naked girls and three clothed men right beneath them, and thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a gender studies class in a capsule.
That's right.
You want to know what the male gaze is, it's that.
Exactly. He must have known that, noticed that he wasn't an idiot.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he hung those paintings.
Yeah.
Although, here's a little theory for you. Maybe he did it because he knew that would make it that much more challenging to have a formalist read of it. It's like, here's the test case. You've got to read these formally. You may want to read them in these other ways. I'm going to make it as hard as I can for you to read it formally, and you're going to have to do it. This is the entrance test to Central High School. This is as hard as it gets.
Well, and I think sort of in terms of thinking about so women at the Barnes, that other sort of great paradox of the Barnes, which is what you started of. I think it's one of the kind of core constitutive fascinating paradoxes of the Barnes is Barnes's relationship also with Black art. So you open your book with this, I think extraordinary cinematic scene of Barnes rolling up in his, I guess, indigo blue 7-seater Packard with butter yellow tires to the Civic Club to this event. It's called the it's sort of the opening party,
the coming out party.
That's it. The coming out party of the
Renaissance.
Harlem Renaissance, with all of the key people. So of the African American thinkers and literati and artists, Elaine Douglas, W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Elaine Locke. You open with this, and the really formative role that Barnes both has on the Harlem Renaissance, and that certainly the Harlem Renaissance has on him. And this is key, and this role that African art and African American art, and there's this sort of category of Black art, which is a pretty unwieldy one, but of his interest in both African art, which he puts on the front portico. I mean, it's what decorates the building before you even walk in. There's this announcement of the importance of African art to the collection. African American spirituals, as you write about, are key. He's having them performed in the galleries.
That's right, yeah.
So, I mean, this is so crucial to him. The whole project is coming out of this work that he's doing at his factory. So it's crucial, and again, but to get at Barnes' complexity, it's also, in a sense, sidelined. The sidelining of contemporary Black art. He only collects one African American artist, the artist Horace Pippin. So just be curious what you make of that. It's something I've grappled with, and I'd love to hear you talk about it.
I think there are two things involved. The most important thing for Barnes, I think, is that if you rule out subject matter, and you rule out biography, which you also did, you weren't ever allowed to talk about the artist's biography, then you've ruled out a lot of what's interesting and important and exciting about African American art. If all you are is a formalist, if all you see is a kind of MoMA, like Alfred Barr-like progression of one movement changing the look of art after another, the truth is that African American artists weren't that interested in that. It wasn't important enough for them, in a sense. They were interested in exploring issues of race through a modernist lens, but they weren't, revolutionizing the look of art in the way Picasso was. So if that's where you're coming from, that's, as a Barnes, you're not going to be buying their work because it doesn't seem important enough. Though he does give Aaron Douglas a fellowship, right? So he does care about it enough to do that. Also, I think he realizes what he's a polymath. we think of him as someone who only cares about art, but he was really very sophisticated in his knowledge of music and poetry. I mean, when he writes the article that I mention here, he mostly talks about African-American poetry, which I think arguably, and African-American novels for that matter, I think you could argue, was more interesting at that moment than African-American visual art. So in that sense, he's on to something there. He wasn't a great fan of jazz, but he mentions it occasionally when convenient as an example of African-American excellence, sort of. But I think he did realize that there were these other aspects of African-American culture, especially given his background in the camp meetings, that mattered to him more than visual art. And remember, he's mostly collecting French visual art. He collects Americans, he collects his friends, but mostly he's really interested in French art. He doesn't collect the most exciting art by Glackens or by Demuth, right? He has lovely examples, but he's not really buying the most exciting things they could do. So he's really a collector of French art. And his taste is fixed very quickly.
Yeah, that's also
in very few years, he's decided what he likes. This is true of many, many, many collectors. He knows what he wants to collect, and he's still buying important early Renoirs at the end of his career, right? And of course, he commissions the great Matisse, in 31, or in 30. So that, I think, is a lot of the answer to why he doesn't collect much African-American art.
Well, I think with that, I got the signal that we should open it up to
I'd
questions
love to have
from
questions,
you.
Please. I've heard what I have to say already, so, or at least
I would love to ask you questions for the next 24 hours, but I think I should open it up to everyone.
Wait for a microphone,
Yeah, and please wait for the microphone just so everyone can hear it.
Yeah. I listened to you this morning. I think it was on WOR something. And I heard most of what you said, but I was wondering, I know he was a collector, but was he also a painter?
Interesting question. He said that he started out, he did art classes in Central High School, and he was clearly interested in art. He was best friends with two important men who go on to become important artists, William Glackens and John Sloan, in high school. He said at one point that he had painted 200 works, or made 200 works of art, and destroyed them all. I think this happens with a lot of art lovers and collectors. Certainly, I'm not one of them. I was a photographer, so that counts, I guess. But a lot of them start out trying to make art and realize they're no good at it, and instead decide they're going to buy it or they're going to write about it. And that was the case with him. So his artistic skills, I don't think, were anything great, but it created a love for him of art, I think, is the answer.
Hi, you started tonight by talking about he went against, really supported Black people when everyone else wasn't. So was he ever, that was a really bold thing for the day, for that time. So was he ever threatened, or was there any backlash against him?
That's a really interesting question, and to be perfectly frank, I never thought about it until this minute. I haven't come across a lot of opposition to him on those grounds. He was mostly attacked for showing modern art, and attacked absolutely as viciously as anyone could be attacked. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that they cared more about the nastiness of Cubism than anything else. But that really got people freaked out. But no, I mean, I think you didn't really want to go after Barnes, without a good reason, because you hate Cubism. I think he was just considered, my guess is he was just considered this insane eccentric, hiring Black workers. Well, if he wants to do that, that's his problem. Remember, he was a very small-time industrialist. He had a total at most of 20 workers, but usually just 12. So it was a very small factory that he ran. So he wasn't threatening the status quo in Philadelphia. I think people could mostly ignore him. I mean, he had one product, this Argerol, this antiseptic, and that made him enough money, never made him a huge fortune, but made him enough money to buy modern art, which was pretty cheap at the time.
Thank you. The passage that you open with, and I unfortunately haven't yet read the book, so all I know about it is what's been
It's only
said
been out for
tonight.
days, so you have an
Okay,
excuse.
all right. It seems to so reflect exactly the moment we're in. And so my question is, when did you, ideas about progressivism, democracy, African Americans, when did you start writing the book? Did you intend for it to go that way, or did that just happen? Yeah.
No, I mean, I began it, 3 years ago, so it wasn't obvious that we were going to be in the moment that we're now in. But I'm a Canadian, so we're kind of born progressives as a rule. And of course, born here in Philly, but grew up in Montreal. But also I'm an art critic, and I deal with contemporary art. And these are issues that are so central to contemporary art that there's no way of, if you're a half-decent critic of contemporary art, you're dealing with them every single day. And it was, I mean, the truth is I didn't know much about the progressive movement. I certainly didn't know Barnes' involvement with it and the people that he was involved with and the other people from the progressive movement who went to the same high school as him. So it was really, in writing the book, it was one of the most exciting things for me. I had to read a whole new literature. And actually, to be perfectly frank, it began at a friend's house that we were borrowing in London. And she was writing a book on the progressive movement, so she had a bookshelf full of books. And we got to talk, and I realized, oh shit, I've got to read every book in this bookshelf now to understand Barnes. But so that came, within the first few months, but not, I hadn't started out that way.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the genesis of his progressivism. You describe him growing up in the Neck. I think you said until he was, or at least by the time he was 8, he was living there.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a fairly brutish environment. It happens to be where I grew up, except not in 1908.
Yeah, lucky you. You were very lucky.
So I'm curious.
Can I just ask a quick question? Had you ever heard of it called the Neck?
Yes, I have.
You had, okay.
Yeah. It's down where now you would think of it as where the stadiums are.
Yeah, it was
That
way
was-
north of that in his day.
I'm sorry?
It was way north of that in
It
his day.
was.
It extended really far, almost to Tasker.
When I was a kid, remnants of it still were evident below, the approach to the expressway. Anyway, I'm curious about the genesis of his progressivism. When you grow up in a brutish environment like you described, you don't usually come out of progressive.
I think it's partly Central High School, which, if not formally progressive, had progressive ideas at its very founding. It was already a very old school. It was decades old by the time he went there. But the notion of helping very poor kids to rise is central to that education. I think that his hatred for the establishment meant he wanted other people to escape it, right? I mean, this is the Gilded Age. He grew up in the Gilded Age and realized that there were these people at the top with unbelievable amounts of money, with their, to use the language of the time, their feet on the necks of the poor. So I think there was, I think some communists have come out of very poor backgrounds, and I think he was not a communist, but I think it's not a huge surprise that someone who felt very oppressed as a young person felt that he wanted to help other people be less oppressed. I mean, he wasn't a doctrinaire progressive, and let's be clear here. He was a patriarch and patriarchal in every way. He ran all of his shows, the factory, the foundation, with an iron hand, right? It wasn't that he was genuinely democratic in behavior, certainly, in attitude. But he certainly had the right values, or those values, very strongly, I think.
Well, I'm thinking something, there's so much I wish we could have talked about, and so read the book. But I'm also just thinking his relationship with John Dewey, who's such a central figure in his life.
We should come back and just do a talk on John Dewey, who's, amazing. Yeah, I mean, what we've lost is how famous John Dewey was. He was by far the most famous philosopher in America, a household name, I mean, really a giant, and transformed American education in a very practical way. His pragmatic, as I said, pragmatic philosophy isn't the easy reading you might think it would be. You'd think it would be transparent. It's orderly, shall we say, but not terribly easy. Vitally important figure. And one of my favorite things about John Dewey is he brought out the sweet guy in Barnes. Barnes was a total sweetheart. John Dewey was famously one of the most mild-mannered men on the planet. So you have this crazy maniac and this incredibly mild-mannered person really loving each other deeply.
Their whole life,
The
yeah.
letters are just lovely. Dear Jack, dear Al. They're really, really lovely letters. And Dewey was always trying to get his friend to calm down. It's like, this isn't doing you any good. Don't do this. And Barnes said, I can't help it. It's the way I was born, you know. We have time for one more?
Hi. Thank you for the references to Central High School. Those of us are very proud of our heritage there. There's a line in the book, though, that may be a little obscure, but in one sentence, he dismisses his career as a physician to go into research to this company. And I thought it was very, very interesting that he quickly determined that he wouldn't have a future, and the people he would see as a doctor were essentially complainers and all got better on their own. Did he ever regret his abandonment of his medical career that way?
He toyed with, if not actual, I mean, he was the doctor friend of all of everyone he knew. Matisse, when Matisse hung the dance in 1931 at the Barnes, he insisted on hammering away himself and had a heart attack while he was doing it. And Barnes was there and called in. Barnes was very good friends. Barnes's class at medical school happened to be extremely good, so he was friends with a lot of extremely talented doctors who became major, major figures in Philadelphia medicine. And Barnes loved to diagnose people. He also loved to diagnose them. He was a kind of a Freudian hobbyist. And sometimes not so much a hobbyist. I mean, one of my favorite episodes in the book, which is probably longer than it should be, is when he tries to get a woman off, a murderess, an obvious murderess who shot her husband, off from a murder charge by employing Freudian psychiatry. And I'll let you read the chapter, but she does get off in the end, but not because of anything Barnes did. So he was a sort of an amateur doctor, an amateur psychiatrist his whole life. But I don't think he ever regretted for a moment, leaving behind first medicine, but then he really leaves behind even his drug making. The factory runs itself completely. He is really good. In fact, the foreman of the factory is a black man. That was unheard of. To put a black man in charge of other people in Philadelphia was considered absolutely unacceptable, but he did that. And the factory ran itself, and he said, all I care about now is art. I don't want to make more money. He could have become a drug magnate of one kind or another, invented other products. He didn't do that. The factory was making just enough money for him to buy the art he loved, and that's what really occupied his entire life after 1912.
You've talked about his relationship with people like Bond and Locke. Can you tell us what his reaction was to the distaste for his art when he brought these paintings back from France and exhibited them? And what, if anything about that relationship led to his falling out with the people who ran the Philadelphia Art Museum?
Yeah, happy to. Sorry, could you just put up your hand? I hate talking into the air. Who just asked me that question? Oh, okay, thank you. I just couldn't see, so it was was desperately looking for you. Yeah, I mean, there's some people make some fun of his new purchases as soon as he's making them, but he has a huge show in 1923 at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he thinks this is going to be it. I'm going to introduce my fabulous collection to the world. Philadelphia will finally learn about modern art and learn to love modern art, and the reviews. I am famous for writing negative reviews. Especially when I was a younger critic, I wrote some absolutely brutal reviews. None were as mean as the reviews that he got for this show. They were, scurrilous, really, really scurrilous. Just ridiculous stuff. They hired a bunch of doctors to diagnose the artist who produced these as being homosexual, degenerate, obviously mentally ill. Let's just say that didn't make him fonder of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia aesthetic establishment. That's really, I think, that more than anything, that experience. If Philadelphia had said, we love your art, we love you, he might very well have given it in the end to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I think, which didn't exist yet really at the time. But he was so soured by that experience. He was so disgusted by that experience that it really led him to turn inward and close the doors. He hadn't yet decided, on the admission policies at the foundation by then, right? This is 1923. And I think that closing the doors had a lot to do with thinking that Philadelphia didn't deserve his art. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, can
Oh,
you-
I think we need the microphone. I think
I
someone
think it's my
is
turn.
here. Yeah. Sorry.
In the way back, I'm confused about your thing about the capitalism, because here's what's happened in this country many, many times is that piggybacks have happened on the backs of black people in all different genres of business. Do you think that he wasn't a capitalist? Because I do, based on what you've said.
Of course, he was definitely
I
a
just
capitalist.
think, but I think that he turned his back when he realized that piggybacking on black people to make money was bad for him. I just want to hear that on you, and then, like, why wouldn't you talk about that?
You know, he did, I'm not sure what to say. He was a capitalist. You're completely right. And capitalist depends on getting people to do a lot of work for you and taking a lot of money that is produced by their labor. That's obvious, right? So he did that absolutely. Within that framework, he could have employed white people. He couldn't have employed black people. Normally, he wouldn't have employed black people at all. He employed black people and paid them more than most white people in those jobs was getting. Absolutely, he was an old-fashioned capitalist and loved the money he made. But compared to other, running dog capitalists, he also cared about black people and helping them. That, yes. Yeah, he definitely did, I think. There's evidence of it. Yeah, thanks.
Before we do, can we please have a big round of applause for these two terrific speakers?
Thank you. Thank you, madam.